very nice crowd we have for our first interdisciplinary exchange for this crazy year, academic year. This is sponsored by the Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion from CLAS. I want to thank Tracy Combe for her tech and for putting this session together, for finding our speakers. It felt like really at the beginning of the year that I wanted to have a session called kind of taking our pulse. So I was envisioning this session for kind of a beginning of the year time, but here we are in November. And I think we still, it's relevant to think about taking our pulse at this time. Things have changed, but it's still important to talk about the things that we're talking about today. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers. Each of them is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A. If you could all keep yourselves muted during the presentations, that would be great. And if you can put your questions in the chat, I can hopefully we'll have time that I can call on you to ask your questions out loud, but if we don't, I'll kind of moderate questions at the end. I think that's all that I have to do in terms of logistics. So our speakers are, I think we'll just go in the order that you are on the flyer. Our first speaker is Faye Caronan, who is our new faculty fellow for diversity and inclusion, and she's chair of ethnic studies. And she is going to be speaking on kind of diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on our campus. So remember, this is kind of the theme of taking our pulse. And our second speaker is Hyeyoung Nelson, who is a clinical assistant professor of health and behavioral sciences. And she's going to be looking at COVID and health disparities. And our third speaker is Natalia Walton, who's a graduate student in the Masters of Social Sciences and Humanities, and a graduate assistant for the Center for Identity and Inclusion. And she's going to be speaking on racial justice. So these are all really big themes that I think it's important for us to talk about and listen to. And so I'm somehow unable to get back to my Zoom screen, but I will allow everybody to mute and enjoy our speakers. So Faye.
Thanks, Marjorie. And I want to apologize in advance. I've over-prepared. I'm going to try to get it all in 10 minutes. I'll be going fast, so please feel free if I've gone over or gone through a slide too quickly, just, save it for questions and hopefully I can talk about it then. All right, I'm going to share screen. Is it up? Okay. Okay. All right. So as Margaret said, I'm going to be talking about DEI initiatives on campus today. I want to start off by
so Faye, sorry to interrupt you. I'm seeing kind of the slides where we're seeing like your.
Yes. Okay. No, that's not it. Sorry. I've done this before, but I seem to now have forgotten how to do this.
You go back to the previous screen, and then if you go all the way down, yeah.
Sorry.
You go all the way down to the bottom. So okay. I do it.
Oh, display settings.
Yeah, right in that one. Oh, I can't. Nope.
No.
over.
Um,
The one that looks like a little TV, the one next to that. That.
this one?
Yep,
Oh, no. um,
it should open.
no. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. Oh, I'll turn that off. That should do it. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I wanted to start off by talking about where we are. So I'm going to talk about a few things, just in terms of the student population and how diverse we are. CU Denver is 48% students of color for undergraduates, and that number is even higher for our new students. I have the breakdown by race here, and I wanted to show us how we are in comparison to Denver and Colorado in general. And one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that our student population is 5.1% Black, but yet the population for Denver is much higher. So just things that for me, that kind of poses questions about why aren't they coming to our campus? What does that mean about how inclusive our campus is for some of these groups where our numbers are lower than the Denver metro area? In terms of the workforce, and I want to say that sorry, I must have put the wrong numbers here. Let me see if I have it. Nope. I wanted to say that in terms of the workforce, we also have some work to do. So for our faculty, and this is all data that I have gotten from Lauren Fontana. I wanted to give her the credit here. The terms here that you're seeing, incumbency, are what we have, the percentage of faculty of color that we have on campus versus how, people of color who are available for those positions. And you'll see that there's a wide discrepancy. I have it both for the campus as a whole and for us here in CLAS. And so I want to say that, the numbers are the most stark in terms of professors, where you have that difference between what our numbers are versus the availability. But, there are differences all around. In terms of the campus climate, if we want to talk about how inclusive we are, just a few things that I've heard as I've been talking to different folks on campus. One of the things that Jacob McWilliams from the Women and Gender Center shared with me is that one of his students has told him, in relation to our, our CU in the city tagline, that this student responded by saying, well, if you can't see me in the classroom, how can I see you in the city? So, for some students, diverse students on campus, that our campus culture is still not quite inclusive enough. And we could think about how we might have to do work in the classrooms, on campus in general, how we might also think about diversifying faculty and staff in order to help students of color have more of a sense of belonging on campus. Some staff of color, and I'm kind of singling out staff in particular because I've heard this more on the staff side than the faculty side, don't feel that they are able to express what they want to say. A recent example that I heard was there was someone who wanted to write a news article that pointed out that we only have 8 Black faculty on campus and that they were censored and were unable to say that. So it's just this feeling of, not being able to say what they want or even share with the rest of the community what we need on our campus. Faculty and staff of color don't feel that their DUI work is recognized. I've also heard that some faculty and staff of color face microaggressions and some face overt aggressions in their most of these are usually in their primary units or in their office spaces. And then another place where you might be able to take the pulse of how inclusive of our campus is for students in particular is on Instagram. There's an account called CU BIPOC Stories, and this isn't only for our campus, but the CU campuses across the system. And that account shares some testimonials from mostly students of color, but some faculty and staff of color, and how they feel they are not included on campus. And how equitable are we? One of the things that has come up a lot in meetings that I've been with BIPOC faculty and staff is the issue of promotions and how transparent they are, and how, if they ask the questions of whether or not faculty and staff of color are considered for these promotions. And I don't have the data on that in particular. What I can say about equity in terms of compensation is that for faculty, there don't seem to be a big gap between what faculty of color make as opposed to what white faculty make. But where we see some compensation gaps are more with our staff. And the biggest compensation gap between, when you look at the staff side, is between executives. So there aren't very many people of color in executive positions, but there is a 31.6% compensation gap between executives who are of color versus white executives. And again, this data I have gotten from Lauren Fontana. Now, where are we going? I want to start off by talking about the Chancellor's commitment to DEI work. What I thought that in the report that she sent out last week that I have copy and pasted here, I really appreciated that she said that, in terms of our DEI work, it's not negotiable, that we need to do this work and we need to do it right. I will say that I was more pessimistic a couple of weeks ago, but with the way the elections have turned out, I think that it will be easier to do DEI work moving forward, especially with the commitment that we have from our Chancellor. And what I really appreciate from our Chancellor is that she wants the work to go beyond, checking boxes, saying that we've gotten this work done. She really has expressed that we have to do this work thoughtfully and intentionally. And to that, the DEI work that is being done across the campus, I can say that in different offices across the university, there are DEI trainings being done. Most of these have been spearheaded by, one or two individuals in that office, and they are kind of doing the work themselves. They make use of resources such as there's a self-paced inclusive leadership training on Coursera that was put together by Brenda Allen. So some offices are using those types of resources in order to have trainings and have conversations in their office. Others are just pulling resources that they can find from across the web in order to jumpstart these discussions in their offices. And then at the college and school level, most colleges and schools have committees that are for the whole college or school that look at DEI work. Some are newer than others. For example, I think the newest one is in the business school. They're just starting to pull together a strategic plan for the next 5 years there. But there is that type of work, those types of committees in different schools and colleges. There's also collaborative research going on. A recent example of that is the School of Public Affairs, put put together an anthology of work from across faculty members across across the school, and some graduate students who are now at other places. And they have a published anthology on the kind of social justice work that they've done. There are offices on the student support side that are looking at student performance gaps. And some offices are actually having their own office climate surveys to try to figure out what more they can be doing within those offices. What I heard from leadership as I talked to different deans and members of the cabinet this past month and a half is that there's this desire for a university-wide vision for DEI. They feel that, what I talked about in the earlier slide, they feel that there are all these different types of initiatives, but there's not a shared vision that coordinates all these different initiatives. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to go back. I didn't mean to go ahead. I also heard that there was wanting more support and guidance for DEI initiatives. In particular, what I heard from deans especially was help and support putting together cluster hires. There was the suggestion of bridge to faculty programs for postdocs or visiting assistant professorships that might lead into tenure track positions. And then just wanting resources for infusing DEI into office and departmental visions, and for putting together equity lenses in different offices and departments. Like I said, different offices are already kind of looking to Google and looking at other places for these types of resources. And so there's this desire maybe to have just one place on the university website that has resources that we could all use so that our efforts would all be coordinated and going to the same place. Okay. And then what I heard from BIPOC faculty and staff was a desire for whatever the DEI vision is to be centered on the needs of BIPOC faculty, staff, and students. There was a concern that sometimes DEI visions and strategic plans are watered down in order to build more of a consensus across campus, but they want a very strong commitment to equity and racial justice centered in this DEI vision. BIPOC faculty and staff are asking for more support in general. For example, for international faculty who might need help getting visas, for counseling, access to counseling for BIPOC faculty and staff who might feel the particular weight of DEI work. They ask for more transparency, like I said earlier, in promotions. That's one area, and then more accountability in general. One idea that came up was kind of a 300 or an ability for faculty and staff to evaluate how the leadership is doing on DEI issues. So that type of accountability. I'm almost done. I know I'm out of time. And I want to say that one of the, moving forward, the DEI task force is tasked with these different, looking at all of these different issues. I won't read them here since I'm running out of time, and I'm happy to talk about these more. And I think that's it. Thank you.
I think I'm next.
And now, yeah, Hyeyoung, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Please step in.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you, everyone, for being here. So today I'm going to talk about COVID and health disparities. This is obviously a really huge topic, and there is only 10 minutes. So my plan is to just give like a little brief overview of what we already know, and then think about 3 areas where this pandemic might have like long-lasting implications that can exacerbate inequities, specifically for racial and ethnic minorities. And so this first slide is just an overview of the racial disparities in COVID-19. It's from the APM Research Lab, and it's really not anything new. I think we've heard so much now, right, about how COVID is disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. This figure is specifically looking at age-adjusted COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 Americans through August 18, 2020. And we can see just right off the bat very clearly that Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, and Latinx communities have been disproportionately impacted. And I would say these trends, while this focuses on mortality, these trends are still very similar if we even think about incidence and if we think about severe morbidity. And so the CDC has kind of highlighted driving factors that they've established might be sort of the social determinants that might explain these racial and ethnic disparities around COVID. And I listed the key ones that they have posted on their website, and that's discrimination, healthcare access and utilization, occupation, educational, income and wealth gaps, and housing. I'm not going to go through all of them as I think they're pretty straightforward, but I did just want to highlight occupation and housing. Occupation is something we've been hearing a lot about. We think about frontline workers and individuals specifically who can't work remotely, right? Who don't have the luxury to work from their offices, that need to be commuting and interacting with individuals like delivery people, grocery workers, and a lot of other people I haven't listed, but unsurprisingly, that population disproportionately includes lower income people of color. And so one thing I'm not talking about as much here is sort of the socioeconomic status, that story, but of course those trends align, right, with kind of the racial and ethnic disparity story that we're seeing. And the other one is with housing. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color are much more likely to live in crowded housing with multiple generations. One study in California that was specifically looking at the really high incidence rate of COVID-19 among Pacific Islanders had found that, you know, among Pacific Islanders, it's customary and almost expected that you live across generations in a single household, or at least you're interacting daily, like very regularly. And one of the things that we know with COVID is the age factor, right? And so recognizing that when you have individuals across generations sharing a space, like in a single house, right, sort of the implications of that. So that being said, I felt that kind of the racial and ethnic disparities around the incidence and prevalence of COVID have been pretty well established, and we've been hearing a lot about it. So I wanted to think more about, and the things that have been interesting me are the pandemic and its role in accelerating other existing inequalities that disproportionately impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And the 3 that I'm going to focus on today is rising food insecurity, learning loss, and housing insecurity. So with food insecurity, you know, there are multiple definitions, but one of the definitions that's commonly used is that food insecurity refers to the limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or limited or uncertain ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. So if we're thinking not the pandemic, pre-pandemic periods, low-income minority neighborhoods are already frequently labeled as food insecure. There are higher rates of food insecurity, there are food deserts, and sort of the health implications of that. And then unsurprisingly, food insecurity in the United States trends with unemployment, right? So it kind of follows unemployment trends. So when there are higher rates of unemployment, there's going to be a rise in food insecurity, which is what we're seeing now with COVID-19. But the one thing to note is, again, if we're thinking pre-pandemic, Even in good economic years, Black and Latinx households will report higher rates of food insecurity. So before the pandemic, there's already this inequity. And now, this is all really early research, right? Everything is sort of, especially these topics, I'd say the implications we won't see till even further. But with some of the reports of food insecurity, this UCLA study found that 36% of Black households, 31% of Latinx households reported food insecurity, in contrast to 16% of non-Hispanic white households. So while, of course, people across racial ethnic groups are experiencing food insecurity, we see a disproportionate impact for Black and Latinx households in this current time. And why does this matter? I mean, it matters just in general, right? Livelihoods, but with food insecurity, we see later on down the line, it has an impact on poor health outcomes. Children who are food insecure are more likely to get an asthma diagnosis. Children who are food insecure when they're young are more likely to report fair and poor health later on. In terms of food insecure seniors, they have much more limitations in their activities of daily living. In contrast, that's actually comparable to food secure seniors who are 14 years older than them. So we see this sort of penalty that even if we address food insecurity in the next year for some of these families who are directly impacted by the pandemic, they might already be on the path for having poorer health outcomes later on. So the next topic is learning loss. This is something I'd say that's gotten a lot of media coverage, definitely the shift to remote learning and then back to in-person and maybe a mixture, right, has led to kind of just concerns of academics. And we know that education and health are very deeply tied. We also know pre-pandemic, there are deep racial and ethnic inequalities when it comes to education. We see an achievement gap for Black, Indigenous people of color. And so that's already there. And now with the pandemic, we have what's commonly been talked about as the digital divide, right? So there's just variation in ability to access the internet, comfort with the internet, comfort with different technologies. And then even across schools, and this is again sort of a resource story too, right? Of some schools can equip their educators and their families and students with the tools they need to promote kind of equitable learning, and then others can't. And so recognizing that that digital divide can really exacerbate educational outcomes in the long run. And then of course, with school closures, there are the implications for learning, but then for food, for housing and safety. And so recognizing that schools take on multiple roles for individuals, particularly for certain more vulnerable groups, where the school really helps secure food, gives a space, a safe place to be, you know, during sort of the day, right? And so recognizing that. And so one of the things that researchers have been doing are starting to project what are the learning loss possibilities. And McKinsey and Company did some epidemiological modeling, and they said that the average student could fall 7 months behind. But for Black students, they could fall 10 months behind, and for Hispanic students, they could fall 9 months behind. And so again, reminding everyone, right, so pre-pandemic, we already have this achievement gap, and recognizing that in the time of COVID and with all these changes that are happening, that achievement gap can be exacerbated. And so I included these two images. These are from 2 New York Times stories that were talking about these educational experiences. And I'd say these resonate with sort of the anecdotal educational experiences that I've been hearing and that I think will come out increasingly in research. And the top picture is Danielle Gandy and her 2 daughters. And she just is talking about the loss of learning, that her daughters are only getting a fraction of the learning that they need, even when they're making a concerted effort, right, to be successful. And then the bottom picture, these are 2 college students, Isabel Canning on the left and Tatiana Lathian on the right. And so Isabel, as soon as she shifted to remote learning, went to her family's vacation home in Maine, where she could work quietly, have a private space for herself, while Tatiana had to help her family on their food truck. And so she's trying to balance sort of helping her family while doing remote learning. And so recognizing that even the experience of trying to successfully remotely learn can be so deeply varied, and the implications of that in the long run. And then lastly, housing insecurity. So it's important to note, again, pre-pandemic, the housing market disproportionately discriminates against people of color, particularly renters of color. They're much more likely to experience difficulties obtaining and maintaining housing. And so we already have that as sort of a backdrop. But then, unsurprisingly, as we all know, job loss has really grown due to the pandemic. And in this one study, as of April 2020, 32% of Black adults, 41% of Latinx adults, and 24% of white adults have reported job loss. And so we know unemployment is rising. And then, unsurprisingly, as one might expect with that job loss, there's now going to be concerns of financial security and can you pay for your housing? Right? And so renters of color have reported being much less confident in their ability to pay rent and experience greater difficulty staying current on rent, even with things like the CARES Act. There have been some protections in place. Many of them have expired or expiring. And ultimately, this is not a problem that ends at the end of this year, right? And some of these acts are only through this year. And so sort of thinking about that. And with that, there's very clear eviction risk. And this is another pre-pandemic issue where people of color are at higher risk of eviction. And so now, when thinking about this whole context, that becomes exacerbated. But then thinking about sort of the long-term consequences of eviction, right? It has a negative impact on credit reports and on public reports. So it starts here and it can just keep trickling down. And so what we see is renters of color are disproportionately relying on savings, retirement, and credit cards. Credit cards have sort of been the new acceptable way of paying for rent during this time of the pandemic, but recognizing that relying on those sources of income can place individuals on a path to deeper financial insecurity and trouble in the long run, which again, we can see how, so collectively, housing insecurity, food insecurity, and education widen racial and ethnic disparities in our social lives more broadly, but then also have very direct impacts on health as well. Okay, I think that's all my time, so thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. So now we'll move on to our final speaker, Natalia.
Thank you. My name is Natalia Walton. I am the Training Events Inclusion Graduate Assistant Coordinator for CII, which is the Center for Identity and Inclusion at CU Denver. I'm calling mine battle fatigue, and we'll go more into that. But I want to say first that when you're on this campus as a student, and that's the perspective that I'll be speaking from, is from the student perspective, it's a bubble. It doesn't include the outside world. CU kind of becomes its own bubble, its own world. It's on its own axis. And we can't really focus on just CU. We have to also look at the outside world, because that affects our students as well. So in the wake of realization, we had George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. There were protests, riots, social media was flooded with activism, news and media was focusing on the riots, on protests, and all of this was going on. And At the time, it was like an awakening, but for many people of color, we've seen not so much an awakening, but a continuum of what we've already seen happening. Then we had to define what it was that we were actually wanting justice for. Many social justice organizations, many social justice groups decided to back Black Lives Matter. They incorporated that into their social justice activism. And we started to see that on campus as well. On campus, we started having discussions, talks, programming. We still have programming and discussions. I got a message from Chancellor Marks as a person of color addressing the George Floyd riots and the incident. We have social justice teach-ins. Many departments and offices hold social justice space, and we have programming centered around that. We also seen many of businesses that students utilize, such as Amazon and Uber, reaching out and saying, "Hey, we're supporting, we're here," and it was a huge thing. But then that became overshadowed. It was overshadowed by a pandemic, and I'm not lessening that by any means. But less and less social media was about Black Lives Matter or social justice. It was more about memes, about social distancing, wearing masks, Zoom fatigue, wearing only the top half of your clothing when you go on Zoom, and then the election, which was a huge thing. So there was a lot of overshadowing. I'm putting this meme up because it is highly relevant. I handle the social media accounts for CII and DEI, and I seen this post several times during the election, several times throughout. There were similar posts, and it was saying, let me go get something to eat before I wake up tomorrow and all of these restaurants say whites only. This is significant because this is how our student body is feeling. The people of color, we're feeling fear, we're feeling fatigued, we're feeling worn out, we're feeling scared, we have withdraw, and we're feeling like we have no advocates, we have no place to go. We're in solitude. We need to address the trauma. We have all, I can't see my notes, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Social justice isn't just discussions or talking about it. It's actually action. I don't like the subtitles. And Chancellor Mark has made a commitment to make sure that we are addressing social justice, but those things take time. And one of the things that we need to look at is, what do we do in the meantime? There needs to be incorporation of diversity and inclusion infused in CU Denver. There needs to be safe spaces for people of color. The syllabus needs to include, all syllabuses need to include offices and departments that are supporting identities, different identities. There needs to be funding and programming to support students and staff with trauma and coping. There needs to be change in hiring practices. There needs to be a rebranding. When I first was applying for graduate school, I didn't want to come to CU because I was told this was the white school. I'm just going to be honest. There wasn't any faces. I didn't get any identity markers that were similar to my own when I applied. I came to the school because finances, basically. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be to where people see their identities reflected on campus. In the classrooms, I'm often, if not always, the only Black female in my class. And I'm in the Humanities and Social Science department with an emphasis of gender women's studies. There are no professors or teachers of my identity that teach in that department either. So a rebranding that includes and demonstrates diversity and inclusion, and an infusion across all departments of diversity and inclusion. And that looks like training of our professors on what social justice looks like within their classroom setting, activism within their classroom setting as well. Follow through. We do a lot of talking, but there is often not follow through. I enjoy the social justice teach-ins, but I'm often left with, what do I do with this information now? Where does it go now? How do I apply it to my life now? And that's the general consensus that I'm getting from students. So yeah, that's what I got.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've had 3 really interesting, thought-provoking speakers. So why don't we have some questions? I know we have one question from Charles in the chat. Does central administration keep data on retention? Between 2008 and 2018, we've lost a lot of faculty of color. Do we have any idea why they left? And Charles, I would say we've also in the last 2 years lost faculty of color as well.
I'm not sure if we do have that data. I'm sure, I wonder if we can get it, but I do know that we do not do exit interviews, and we do, we need that data, and that's, one of the recommendations that has already been made to the chancellor, and hopefully the equity task force will also include that in the recommendations they make as they're working out on their plan.
Other questions?
This is Terry Cooney. I was going to comment too, Faye, to add on to that is it might be useful in addition to exit interviews to talk with candidates who we've offered positions to who turn them down. We've had that happen a couple times in sociology with faculty of color. And I don't know if they'd be as honest with me as they might with someone outside the department to talk about reasons why they chose not to take the position. So I think that would be helpful.
Thanks, Terry. I do think that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that before. One of the things that we're also thinking of doing is entrance interviews or interviews after the first semester. So asking incoming faculty of color after they've been around for a semester what they need, what other support that they would need in order to be successful. So more, checking in regularly as well.
Right. Julia asks, how can we increase the diversity of our faculty body?
There have been a few suggestions that I think could be implemented. So cluster hires, the cluster hires would be beneficial because then you would have faculty of color coming in at the same time who could then, support one another as they go through the tenure process and go through the tenure track. Another idea, as I had mentioned earlier, is some of the deans talked about how at their previous institutions there were bridge to faculty programs, so postdocs or visiting assistant professorships that where you'd have some faculty of color teaching classes and then be able to eventually offer some of those postdocs or visiting assistants tenure lines. Those are just some of the ideas.
I have a question, Faye. Is it possible that we can offer different types of classes more centered around maybe what a professor expresses interest in or what they focused on in their career or outside of their career? Maybe that would prompt more hiring of people of color?
I think that question, it would depend on the needs of the different departments, what courses they have to be able to teach given their curriculum, and then beyond that, what electives they want to offer based on if there's interest and enough enrollment in those. So I don't think there's an easy response for that, since a lot of it depends on the needs of different departments.
Anne asks, is there still a faculty mentoring program? I remember Brenda Allen often talked about her role in mentoring faculty. Yet there used to be this university-wide mentoring program, and I think that it was grant funded, and that money ran out, and I don't think we've kind of picked up on that.
Yeah, there is still a faculty. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Veronica.
Oh, Veronica's in the chat, but there is still a faculty mentoring program through the Center for Faculty Development. And I think that they're also thinking of putting together a community of practice for faculty of color as well.
Yeah. But isn't that, people have to reach out for that? And I'm just like, right, it's not, you're not assigned. Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
What about a staff mentoring program?
That's a good idea. I think that's something that we can look into. Thank you, Karen.
Other questions?
This is Terry again. I wanted to ask Natalie, I thought it was interesting, your description of the campus as a bubble. And one of my questions is, as a student of color, do you find that your kind of lack of sense of belonging or fit is stronger like in the classroom, or is it more kind of part of the entire campus environment and atmosphere? Or are there some specific things you can point out that you think are the most difficult and challenging for students of color?
Yeah. My name is actually Natalia, but I get called Natalie quite a bit.
I'm sitting here reading without my reading glasses.
No, it's fine. I think it's harder via Zoom now because you're isolated in your environment. You're not in the classroom, so there's a particular incident. I was in one of my classes, and the professor said something that along the lines of, it's gotten so much better for us. And I looked around the Zoom, I looked around the screen, and I really wanted to just do that look like, did he really just say that? Did that really just come out his mouth? But there's no one there that identifies with me or like me that understood that comment, why it was so wrong. It implies privilege, it creates otherness, and this particular professor could not speak to everyone's identity when he says it's better for us. Who is us? But everyone in my classroom is Caucasian, and even the women wouldn't be able to identify with that situation. So I felt kind of alone, and I'm a boisterous person. I have no problem speaking up for myself. So I, of course, called the professor on it, but there's many students that are in the classroom and that situation happens and they're not able to speak up for themselves. They kind of withdraw and just allow the discussion and commentary to continue, and no one should feel like that. And then when you do feel like that, who do you go to after? Where's the safe space for you to actually talk about that, so that doesn't happen again, or you're able to vent about that microaggression that happened in that classroom, right? So I think it's worse on Zoom. And the bubble that I was referring to is, we think about the things that are happening on campus, our programming, our food deserts, our food pantry. We think about our offices, our departments, our staff members, but students they deal with outside situations. Not everyone, we're on Auraria campus. I mean, we're in the middle of downtown Denver, and not everyone is coming straight out of high school, and their parents are paying for college. Some of them are first generation. Some of them are not even from this country. I'm 43 years old. I have 5 children. And I've attended every school on Auraria campus, from CCD to MSU to now CU Denver. But I'm first generation, and that the complexities of my learning are different than the people that are in my classroom, you know, and we don't think about those things. I'm not only worried about what I have to do for finals, I'm also worried about how am I going to pay my rent, right? So that's why I say it's like a bubble, because we don't think about the outside resources, and that's one of the things that I wanted to bring to CII when I signed up to work here, was incorporating the outside resources with the inside resources. So I'm definitely giving out human services numbers and housing numbers. I posted when Denver opened up their Section 8. That's what we have to do, because we can't stay in the bubble. And I'm sorry, I keep talking. I'm sorry.
No, it's really, really helpful. And it's great to hear from you. I wanted to hear from Hyeyoung as well. I'm wondering if, you know, the issues that you raised in your talk, can you see, or have you encountered kind of an intersection between these issues that are affecting the community at large and students at CU on our campus, these issues of housing insecurity and food insecurity, and trying to remember the third thing that you talked about. But do you see, you know, have you encountered these in kind of real life for us?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I sadly have, and I'd say a lot of I've had issues of housing insecurity where some students have said they might, like they're dealing with eviction risk, and then definitely some food insecurity, but then also probably some of the stuff I didn't talk about as much, but like the family obligations that we see in that loss of learning, right? Where like the one woman, Tatiana, has to work on the food truck for her family. And definitely I'd say, fortunately, students have felt comfortable telling me, but they have told me that they've taken on extra shifts, they've taken on work for their families. They've had multiple household, like one young woman had her grandparents, her aunt, her mom, and her siblings all living there, and everyone got sick with COVID, including her. And so just navigating all of those things. And so it's not, so they're all like layered together, and it is just leads to so many different dilemmas to deal with, and then trying to still be in touch with me about school.
Right. I mean, I feel like, as Natalia said, some of this is much more difficult because we're not in person and we're not in contact with students to get the pulse, right? We don't know, I think, how difficult this is right now, you know, as much as we would if we were on campus.
I agree. And I think, unfortunately, the responsibility starts to get pushed onto the student to communicate with you in a way that might be easier in person versus through email. And just, I do feel like there's more shouldering of responsibilities for students who are already dealing with a lot of other things to then communicate and feel that they have to justify why they might be struggling.
Yeah, that's very difficult. All right, well, we're a couple of minutes over, so I think we will end. Thank you so much, Faye, Natalia, and Hyeyoung. These were really great talks, and I think you leave us with a lot to think about. It feels like we need to do a follow-up because there's so much here that we need to address. So thank you. and hope to see you again at another interdisciplinary exchange. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you. Thanks a lot.